15th of June, 1966. Hill 488, Quang Nam Province, South Vietnam. 18 Marines from 1st Reconnaissance Battalion occupied a small rise marked on U.S. maps as observation terrain. By midnight, an estimated 250 to 300 PEVN and Viet Cong soldiers had surrounded them. Radio calls grew urgent. Artillery fire missions multiplied. Then came the request that broke doctrinal rules. Napalm and high explosives delivered within 30 meters of the American perimeter, well inside the safety distances printed in every fire support manual. Modern doctrine defines danger close as ordnance delivered inside the distance, corresponding to a 0.1% probability of incapacitating friendly troops. On Hill 488, that probability became a conscious choice. By dawn, 14 Americans were dead, including reinforcements and aircrew. Dozens of enemy bodies lay in the wire. This is the story of how survival in Vietnam required calling fire on your own position and what that decision cost. A field artillery manual lay open on a desk at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in early 1966. Laminated fire support tables filled the pages, each line showing a weapon caliber, a munition type, and a number, the risk estimate distance, or RED. These distances, 600 meters for a 155mm howitzer firing high explosive, 750 meters for certain naval gunfire, represented the range at which the probability of incapacitating a friendly soldier dropped to 0.1%. The tables were precise. The doctrine was clear. Fire support could be brought close to friendly troops, but only with explicit acknowledgement of risk. The same tables soon appeared in map cases across South Vietnam. Officers carried them into the field. Forward observers memorized the key figures. Fire direction centers posted them on plywood boards. The system seemed simple. When friendly troops were inside the printed RED for a given weapon, the fire mission became danger close. Additional procedures applied. The supported commander had to accept the risk. Gun crews verified their data twice. Everyone understood the stakes. The standard call for fire sequence followed 6 steps: observer identification, warning order, target location, target description, method of engagement, and method of fire and control. The term danger close was inserted immediately after target location when the target fell inside the tabulated RED. A 1966 field manual stated plainly that ordnance inside the listed distance will be considered danger close, and required commanders to balance the tactical necessity against the risk to their own troops. On paper, danger close was a controlled exception. In practice, Vietnam would test whether those printed numbers could survive contact with an enemy determined to collapse every safety margin. The mathematical framework arrived first. Combat conditions would decide whether the framework held. A situation map covered one wall of a division fire support coordination center in 1st Corps Tactical Zone, South Vietnam, mid-1966. The map showed fire support bases scattered across the terrain like pins on fabric, hilltops, ridgelines, and cleared patches of jungle, each marked with a circle representing artillery range. Dotted lines connected the circles, showing overlapping coverage. The lattice looked reassuring. U.S. commanders expected this web of guns and aircraft to prevent small units from being overrun. The concept was firepower dominance. Infantry and armor would maneuver, but they would almost never fight alone. Artillery battalions provided responsive fire 24 hours a day. Tactical aircraft stood on strip alert. Naval gunfire reached inland from destroyers and cruisers offshore. The system was designed so that any platoon in contact could call for support within minutes, often within seconds. Typical fire support bases mounted 105mm howitzers, the M101A1 and M102, firing high explosive rounds out to 11 kilometers. Heavier 155mm howitzers, both towed M114A1s and self-propelled M109s, reached to 14 kilometers and delivered far greater destructive effect. In some sectors, 175mm guns provided counter-battery fire and long-range interdiction, their shells arcing out to 32 kilometers. Fire direction centers converted observer corrections into firing data, charge selection, deflection angles, fuse settings, time of flight. The radios that tied the system together were ubiquitous. The AN/PRC-25, weighing 23 pounds with battery, became standard issue at platoon level. Its successor, the AN/PRC-77, appeared later in the war with improved reliability. These radios connected forward observers to FDCs, infantry companies to artillery battalions, and ground units to airborne forward air controllers. The grid promised constant, reliable support. Divisional artillery histories recorded the volume of fire In large operations, such as the fighting around Khe Sanh or during Operation Scotland, Marine and Army artillery fired over 100,000 rounds in single months. One after-action summary noted that a single Marine artillery regiment expended more ammunition in 6 weeks than had been used in some entire World War II campaigns. The firepower was there. The question was how close it could safely be applied. The grid architecture created an expectation. No unit should ever be beyond the reach of supporting fires. That expectation would push small patrols and isolated outposts toward a stark choice. Fight without fire support, or accept fire well inside doctrinal safety margins. The lattice of guns did not eliminate danger-close decisions. It made them routine. A U.S. Lessons Learned report, Sati. On a staff table in Saigon, late 1965, the subject line read, Enemy Tactics Close Engagement. The report summarized multiple engagements where PAVN and Viet Cong forces deliberately closed to within 50 or 100 meters of American positions before opening fire. Some contacts began at even shorter ranges. The pattern was clear and intentional. U.S. and South Vietnamese planners had assumed that firepower and mobility would keep engagements at distances where artillery and air could be used freely. Doctrine emphasized standoff, fix the enemy, call for fire, maneuver under the cover of that fire. The system worked well at ranges beyond 500 meters. Communist commanders, however, had drawn lessons from the First Indochina War against French forces. They knew that closing with the enemy, grabbing the enemy by the belt, in one formulation, could neutralize much of the American firepower advantage. The tactic had logic. At 50 meters, U.S. artillery could not be safely employed without endangering friendly troops. At 100 meters, tactical airstrikes risked hitting American positions. Helicopter gunships had to exercise extreme caution. The closer PAVN or VC units could get before the fight began, the narrower the American margin for using supporting fires. In dense jungle or rubber plantation terrain, where visibility was measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds, hugging tactics became especially effective. Massive intelligence reports documented the approach. Australian official histories described enemy attempts to fight at such close quarters that supporting fires could not be employed. Vietnamese accounts later credited senior political and military leaders with promoting close engagement as a deliberate counter to American technological superiority. The goal was not to win firefights at arm's length, but to force the Americans into situations where their own firepower became a liability. The implications were immediate. U.S. doctrine envisioned danger close as a rare, controlled method of engagement. PAVN and VC doctrine aimed to make it the default condition. If American units wanted fire support in close contact, they would have to accept the risks printed in those Fort Sill tables, or do without. The contrast was stark. U.S. expectations built around keeping the enemy outside safety distances, an opponent working systematically to compress those distances to zero. At landing zone X-ray in the Drang Valley, November 1965, that collision would play out in full. Artillery and air strikes would be delivered so close to American lines that official reports would later record friendly casualties from supporting fires. The doctrinal tables were about to be tested under live fire. 14th of November 1965, Drang Valley, Pleiku Province, South Vietnam. A radio log from landing zone X-ray recorded dozens of fire missions as PAVN attacks built through the afternoon and into darkness. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, had inserted by helicopter into terrain held by elements of 3 PAVN regiments. The concept, helicopter-borne infantry deep in enemy-controlled areas, was new. The expectation was that mobility and fire support would allow outnumbered American battalions to operate safely. The reality arrived within hours. PAVN troops closed on the landing zone from multiple directions. U.S. artillery, primarily 105mm howitzers from fire support base Falcon, fired continuously. Tactical air strikes by F-100 Super Sabres and F-4 Phantoms delivered bombs and napalm around the perimeter. As PAVN assaults pressed closer, the safety distances shrank. Forward observers adjusted fire inward. Some strikes landed within 100 meters of American foxholes, some landed closer. Official summaries later acknowledged that a small number of U.S. casualties at Drang resulted from friendly artillery and napalm. The after-action reports did not quantify the number precisely, but the fact was documented and discussed. The fire had been necessary. PAVN infantry had reached the tree line and, in some sectors, broken into the perimeter. Without the close-in strikes, the landing zone might have been overrun. The choice was explicit. Accept a known quantifiable risk from your own firepower, or accept a near-certain outcome from enemy assault. Commanders on the ground, including Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore, made repeated decisions to bring fire closer. Artillery fire direction centers processed the missions under doctrinal danger close procedures, verifying each correction. Pilots flew strike runs parallel to American lines, releasing ordnance at minimum safe distances and sometimes inside them. The system worked, but at a cost measured in friendly casualties as well as enemy dead. The battle demonstrated a principle that would recur throughout the war. Superior firepower could save a surrounded unit, but only if that unit was willing to accept fire inside the margins printed in the tables. Drang became a reference point. It validated the air-mobile concept. It also validated the idea that, in close contact with a determined enemy, danger close would be not an exception, but a necessity. U.S. losses at Drang were heavy. 79 killed in action at LZ X-ray alone over 3 days, with another 121 killed in subsequent fighting at LZ Albany. Pavan losses were estimated far higher, over 800 confirmed by body count, with total casualties likely exceeding 1,000. The firepower had worked, but the requirement to use it at very close range had been established on the war's first major battlefield, 15th of June, 1966, Hill 488, Quang Nam Province, South Vietnam. An 18-man reconnaissance patrol from Company D, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, 1st Marine Division, occupied a small rise southwest of Chu Lai. The patrol, led by Staff Sergeant Jimmy E. Howard, had been inserted by helicopter the previous day. The mission was observation. Watch trails, report enemy movement, call artillery on targets of opportunity. No one expected sustained combat. The patrol was detected. PAVN or VC scouts spotted the Marines, and by nightfall, an estimated 250 to 300 enemy soldiers had moved into position around the hill. The attack began shortly after dark. Mortar rounds impacted on the hilltop. Small arms fire came from multiple directions. The Marines formed a tight perimeter and returned fire. Radio calls went out immediately. Troops in contact, request artillery and air support. The first artillery missions landed on the slopes below the Marine position. Forward observers adjusted fire based on sound, on muzzle flashes, and on the movement of tracer rounds. Each correction brought the impact zone closer. As the enemy closed in, the Marines requested gunship support. UH-1E helicopters from Marine observation squadrons arrived overhead, firing 2.75-inch rockets and 7.62mm machine guns. Fixed-wing aircraft, A-4 Skyhawks, followed with bombs and napalm. The proximity became extreme. Official accounts, compiled later in Marine Corps historical monographs, described ordnance impacting within 30 meters of the Marine perimeter. Some veterans recalled closer impacts. The decision was made repeatedly through the night: bring the fire in or lose the position. Each adjustment risked shifting the ordnance onto friendly troops. Each adjustment was necessary. By dawn, 6 Marines were dead on the hill. All 12 survivors were wounded. Relief forces and helicopter crews suffered additional casualties, bringing the total American dead to 14. Dozens of enemy bodies lay around the perimeter and on the approaches. U.S. estimates credited the defenders and supporting fires with at least 42 enemy killed, possibly many more. The numbers alone did not convey the reality. An isolated patrol had survived by requesting fire well inside every printed safety distance. The after-action report entered Marine Corps records as a small unit action, notable for the courage of the defenders and the intensity of the supporting fires. It also became a case study in danger close procedures. Staff Sergeant Howard received the Medal of Honor. The patrol's survival validated the concept. When withdrawal was impossible and reinforcement unlikely, calling fire on your own position could be the only rational choice. Hill 488 was not unique. Across South Vietnam, small patrols and isolated outposts faced similar decisions. The doctrine had anticipated the possibility. Vietnam made it routine. 18th of August, 1966. A rubber plantation near Long Tan, Phuoc Toi Province, South Vietnam. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, moved through the plantation in heavy rain to investigate mortar positions that had shelled the Australian base at Nui Dat the previous night. Company Commander Major Harry Smith expected to locate and disrupt a small enemy force. Instead, his lead platoon made contact with elements of a VC main force regiment. Within minutes, the entire company was engaged. The Australian force was heavily outnumbered. Intelligence estimates later placed enemy strength at 1,500 to 2,500 troops from the 275th VC Regiment and supporting elements of the D445 Provincial Battalion. The Australians formed a defensive position in the plantation and called for artillery support. The Fire Direction Centre at Nui Dat responded immediately. The volume of fire was extraordinary. 1st Field Regiment, Royal Australian Artillery, along with U.S. Army 155mm guns from the U.S. 2nd Battalion, 35th Artillery, fired over 3,500 rounds in approximately 3 hours. The majority were 105mm high-explosive shells, but the total included 155mm rounds and some white phosphorus for marking and obscuration. The density of fire was among the highest recorded in any single engagement of the war. As the VC pressed closer, the Australian forward observer brought fire in tight. Official Australian histories record that artillery was adjusted danger close to within 50 meters of the Australian positions. Rain and poor visibility made visual correction difficult. The forward observer relied on sound and on reports from platoon commanders. Each correction carried the risk of a short-round landing among the Australians. The alternative was being overrun. The fire held. VC assaults broke under the weight of high-explosive shells landing in the plantation rows. Reinforcements, 2 companies from 6th RAR, arrived late in the engagement, delivered by U.S. Army armored personnel carriers. The combination of artillery and reinforcement stabilized the position. By evening, the VC withdrew, leaving the field to the Australians. D Company suffered 18 killed and 24 wounded. Enemy losses were claimed in the hundreds, though Vietnamese sources later acknowledged smaller figures. The artillery had been decisive. Post-battle assessments credited the fire support with preventing the company's destruction. Major Smith and his forward observer had made repeated danger-close decisions under pressure, trusting the accuracy of the guns and the discipline of the gun crews. Long Tan became a defining engagement for the Australian Army in Vietnam. It validated small unit tactics and demonstrated the effectiveness of well-coordinated fire support. It also demonstrated the same principle seen on Hill 488. Survival could require bringing fire to the edge of your own position and trusting the geometry to hold. 1967 1st Corps Tactical Zone, South Vietnam, near the demilitarized zone. Marine Corps operational summaries described an artillery duel of unprecedented intensity. PAVN artillery and rocket forces, operating from positions north of the DMZ and from within South Vietnam, bombarded U.S. and ARVN bases such as Con Thien, Geo Linh, Camp Carroll, and the Rock Pile. Communist forces fired an estimated 40,000 rounds over a period of months. U.S. response was overwhelming. Marine and Army artillery fired more than 280,000 rounds in counter-battery missions and defensive fires. The concept of final protective fires, FPF, became central to base defense. FPF was a pre-planned artillery concentration, plotted on maps in advance, designed to be triggered when an assault on a defensive position was imminent or underway. The fires were laid directly in front of defensive lines, often within 200 meters, sometimes closer. The purpose was to create an impenetrable barrier of steel and high explosive across likely avenues of enemy approach. Doctrine defined FPF as a last resort measure. Commanders planned the fires but hoped never to call them. In Vietnam, the routine bombardment of bases and the threat of ground assault made FPF planning standard procedure. Fire direction centers maintained firing data for FPF missions, ready to execute on command. Gun crews kept ammunition at hand. The concept was simple. If the enemy reached the wire, saturate the ground in front of your position with everything available. The distances involved were well inside standard risk estimate distances. A 105mm howitzer firing FPF might place shells 150 meters from friendly bunkers. A 155mm howitzer might fire at 200 meters. The fires were danger close by definition, but they were also pre-planned and rehearsed. The risk was known, accepted, and built into the defense plan. Historical accounts from Marine artillery officers described FPF as a wall of fire. One after-action report noted that FPF bought time for reinforcements and prevented penetration of the perimeter. Another acknowledged that the proximity of the fires required absolute trust in firing data and gun crew discipline. The reports did not record friendly casualties from FPF missions at Con Thien or similar bases, but the potential was always present. The artillery duels of 1967 normalized the idea that defensive survival might depend on fires delivered at the edge of safety. The concept extended beyond isolated patrols. Entire bases planned to defend themselves by firing as close as geometry and mathematics allowed. The doctrine had evolved. Danger close was no longer an emergency exception. It was a routine element of defensive fire planning. The logic would reach its fullest expression at Khe Sanh in 1968, where a besieged combat base would rely almost entirely on fires delivered in a narrow ring around its perimeter. The stage was set. 1967 to 1969, multiple sectors across South Vietnam. A maintenance log for an AH-1G Cobra attack helicopter recorded 12 armed sorties in 3 days, each in direct support of ground units in contact. The Cobra, introduced in 1967, was the U.S. Army's first purpose-built attack helicopter. Its mission was close air support delivered from a rotary wing platform with speed, flexibility, and firepower concentrated in a narrow airframe. Standard armament included a nose-mounted turret with a 7.62mm minigun or 40mm grenade launcher and stub wings carrying 2.75-inch rockets in 7-shot or 19-shot pods. Some Cobras carried mixed loads, rockets on one side, minigun pods on the other. Total ammunition loads varied, but a typical configuration could deliver over 1,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition and dozens of rockets in a single engagement. The tactical advantage over fixed-wing close air support was immediacy. A Cobra orbiting near a ground unit could respond within minutes, often within seconds. Pilots had visual contact with the battlefield. They could identify friendly positions, mark targets, and adjust fire based on real-time radio communication with troops on the ground. The flexibility came with risk. Close visual flight meant exposure to ground fire. Low-altitude rocket runs brought the aircraft within effective range of small arms and machine guns. Danger close distances for helicopters were shorter than for fixed-wing aircraft or artillery. Doctrinal guidance, formalized after the war, listed 100 to 300 meters as typical danger close ranges for 2.75-inch rockets, depending on angle of attack and munition type. In practice, pilots fired closer when requested. Army aviation histories and pilot memoirs describe firing runs parallel to friendly positions at distances measured in tens of meters, particularly at night or in dense terrain where visual references were limited. The pilots relied on smoke grenades, tracer rounds, and verbal directions to identify the target line. Forward air controllers, flying in light observation helicopters such as the OH-6 Cayuse, marked targets with white phosphorus rockets. The system worked, but it required absolute clarity in communications and absolute trust between the ground unit and the aircrew. A pilot firing rockets at 100 meters distance from friendly troops had almost no margin for error in heading or release timing. Helicopter gunships extended the firepower grid in both space and time. They reached areas beyond artillery range. They responded faster than fixed-wing aircraft. They brought heavy, concentrated fire to bear at very short distances. They also increased the frequency of danger-close decisions because help seemed always available overhead. The temptation to pull fire in tight became harder to resist when a Cobra was orbiting a few hundred meters away, ready to roll in on a target within seconds of a radio call. The cumulative effect was to make danger close fire support a routine expectation rather than an exceptional procedure. Ground units learned to rely on it, pilots trained for it, fire support coordinators planned for it. By 1968, calling fire inside doctrinal safety margins had become a standard technique across South Vietnam. January to April 1968, Khe Sanh Combat Base, Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. A daily fire summary recorded 4,000 to 5,000 artillery rounds fired in a single 24-hour period. The base, located near the Laotian border and astride Route 9, had been under siege since late January. PAVN forces, estimates ranged from 2 to 4 divisions, occupied the hills around the base and subjected it to daily artillery, mortar, and rocket bombardment. U.S. response was Operation Niagara, a concentration of firepower unprecedented in scale and coordination. Marine artillery at Khe Sanh and supporting fire bases fired approximately 158,000 rounds during the siege period. U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps aircraft dropped over 100,000 tons of bombs in the surrounding area, equivalent to 5 Hiroshima-yield atomic weapons in high-explosive tonnage. B-52 bombers flew arc-light missions, each strike delivering 30 tons of bombs in rectangular patterns around PAVN staging areas and suspected troop concentrations. Tactical aircraft flew close air support missions hourly. The weight of fire was designed to interdict PAVN movements, destroy artillery positions, and break up any assault before it could reach the wire. Defensive fire plans at Khe Sanh included multiple final protective fire lines plotted on the approaches to the base. Artillery batteries registered on pre-planned targets, conducting check rounds to verify accuracy. Fire direction centers maintained firing data for immediate execution. The FPF lines were close, 200 to 300 meters from the outer wire in most sectors, closer in some. If a ground assault materialized, the plan called for saturating those lines with high explosive shells at maximum rate of fire. The siege tested the concept of firepower dominance. The base could not be easily reinforced or resupplied by ground. Helicopters faced heavy anti-aircraft fire. Fixed-wing transports made risky approaches under fire. The garrison, roughly 6,000 Marines and ARVN Rangers at peak, relied almost entirely on supporting fires to prevent being overrun. Every aspect of the defense, from perimeter wire to ammunition bunkers, was planned around the assumption that artillery and air would arrive on time, on target, and as close as necessary. The fires worked. PAVN forces probed the perimeter repeatedly, but never launched a full-scale assault on the main base. Outposts such as Hill 861A and Hill 881S endured heavy attacks and held, largely due to responsive fire support. The siege was lifted in early April when Operation Pegasus, a combined Marine and Army relief operation, reopened Route 9. Khe Sanh became a symbol of American firepower and marine endurance. It also became the logical extreme of danger-close doctrine. The base survived because its defenders were willing to plan, rehearse, and if necessary execute fires at distances that placed them inside the blast radius of their own ordnance. The 0.1% probability of incapacitation printed in the Fort Sill tables was not theoretical at Khe Sanh. It was a calculated, accepted element of the defense plan. 1968 to 1970, fire direction centers across South Vietnam. A chalkboard in an artillery FDC showed firing data for 3 concurrent missions. One mission, marked Danger Close, included additional verification steps: double check of grid coordinates, confirmation of charge and deflection, and a handwritten note that the supported commander had accepted the risk. The note included the commander's initials and the time of acceptance. Inside the FDC, the process was systematic but conducted under pressure. A call for fire arrived by radio. Observer identification, target location, target description, method of engagement. The FDC plotted the target on a map, measured the range and direction from the gun position to the target, and consulted firing tables to determine charge, deflection, and fuse setting. Meteorological data, wind speed, wind direction, air temperature, air density, was incorporated. Gun tube wear, recorded for each howitzer, was factored into range calculations. When the observer transmitted danger close, the FDC chief initiated additional procedures. The grid coordinates were read back and confirmed. The range was checked against the risk estimate distance for the weapon and munition type. If the target was inside the red, the FDC contacted the supported unit to confirm that the commander accepted the risk. Firing data was computed and verified by a second FDC operator. Only then were firing commands issued to the gun crews. The chain of responsibility was explicit. The supported commander, typically a company commander or platoon leader on the ground, bore responsibility for accepting the danger-close risk. The FDC bore responsibility for accurate firing data. The gun crews bore responsibility for correct laying and firing. Any error in the chain could turn a protective mission into a friendly fire incident. The tools were analog: firing tables printed on paper, charts and graphs for corrections, slide rules for calculations, plotting boards for azimuth and range. Later in the war, some FDCs received digital devices, but most relied on manual methods throughout. The system worked because it was practiced, drilled, and understood. FDC operators trained to compute firing data in under a minute. Gun crews trained to lay and fire in under 30 seconds. The speed was necessary. Units in contact could not wait. Professional military journals and post-war analyses debated the adequacy of danger-close procedures. Some argued for clearer language in the acceptance protocol. Others suggested that the 0.1% PI threshold was too conservative, and that in practice, danger-close fires were safer than the tables implied. Still others noted that the tables were based on statistical models and did not account for terrain shielding, vegetation, or the difference between blast overpressure and fragmentation effects. The debates did not change the fundamental reality. Every danger-close mission required a human decision under stress. The FDC provided the geometry. The supported commander provided the judgment. The gun crews provided the execution. When all 3 elements aligned, the system saved lives. When any element failed, friendly casualties resulted. The margin for error was measured in meters and in single-digit deflection changes. Geometry held until it didn't. 1965 to 1973. Various battlefields across South Vietnam, post-war analytical centers, including Fort Benning and the Army War College. A staff study on friendly fire incidents lay open on a desk, its summary page showing estimated percentages of casualties by cause. Friendly fire, fratricide, was difficult to quantify. Reporting was inconsistent. Chaotic battlefield conditions made causal attribution uncertain. Political sensitivity discouraged detailed investigation. Nevertheless, the data existed. Post-war analyses estimated that friendly fire accounted for a small but measurable percentage of U.S. casualties in Vietnam, typically cited in the range of 2 to 5%. Though some studies suggested higher figures for specific types of engagements. Artillery and close air support, the very systems designed to protect ground troops, occasionally caused casualties among those troops. The causes varied: misplotting of grid coordinates, misidentification of targets, shifting front lines, errors in fire direction computation, premature detonations, and the inherent dispersion of unguided munitions. Specific cases were documented. At Drang, in November 1965, official reports explicitly noted friendly casualties from close-in artillery and napalm. In other engagements, investigation boards reconstructed incidents where short rounds landed on friendly positions or where aircraft struck the wrong target. The investigations examined FDC logs, pilot debriefs, radio transcripts, and physical evidence. Most incidents resulted from procedural failures or communication breakdowns rather than equipment malfunction. Some errors were simple: a digit transposed in a grid coordinate, shifting the impact point by several hundred meters. Other errors were more complex: a forward observer using an incorrect map datum, causing all subsequent fires to be plotted off by a consistent offset. Night and jungle conditions exacerbated the problem. Visual references disappeared, map reading became difficult, identifying friendly positions from the air required clear marking with smoke or panels, and even then, mistakes occurred. The investigative process sought to assign responsibility and identify corrective measures. Changes to procedures were implemented. Mandatory readback of danger close grids, requirement for commanders' initials in FDC logs, standardized marking for friendly positions, improved coordination between ground units and aircraft, training incorporated lessons learned. Fire support schools drilled danger close scenarios with emphasis on verification and clarity. The statistical share of friendly fire casualties was modest. The psychological and moral impact was disproportionate. Soldiers understood the risk of enemy fire. They accepted it as part of combat. Friendly fire violated a fundamental expectation that their own side's firepower was protective, not threatening. Veterans described the experience of calling artillery danger close as combining relief. Help was arriving, with fear that the help might land in the wrong place. The trust required was absolute. The cost of broken trust was measured in lives. The studies fed into doctrinal revisions. Post-Vietnam manuals formalized the 0.1% PI standard. Risk estimate distances were codified in joint publications. Danger close became an explicit term of art, with defined procedures and acceptance protocols. The modern fire support system inherited these lessons directly. Every table, every checklist, every requirement for commanders' initials traced back to decisions made under fire in Vietnam, and to the incidents when those decisions failed. Late 1970s to 2000s, U.S. Army and Marine Corps doctrinal centers at Fort Sill, Quantico, and other training installations. A Joint Fires Reference Manual, eventually standardized as ATP 3-09-32, also known as J-Fire, lay open to the danger close table. The table listed each weapon system, each munition type, and the corresponding risk estimate distance. For a 105mm howitzer firing high explosive, the red was 600 meters. For a 155mm howitzer, 750 meters. For a 500-pound general-purpose bomb, 610 meters. For 2.75-inch rockets from a helicopter, 295 meters. Each number represented the range at which the probability of incapacitating a friendly soldier from blast or fragmentation dropped to 0.1%. The modern formalization of danger close was a direct descendant of Vietnam experience. Post-war doctrine explicitly defined danger close as ordnance delivered inside the risk estimate distance. The definition appeared in Army field manuals, Marine Corps warfighting publications, and joint doctrinal literature. Procedures were standardized across services. When a fire mission was danger close, the observer announced it immediately after transmitting the target location. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged the danger close status. The supported commander was required to explicitly accept the risk, usually by transmitting initials or an acknowledgement phrase. Technology improved some elements of the system. Laser rangefinders provided precise distance measurements, reducing reliance on map reading and estimation. GPS enabled accurate position reporting for both observer and target. Digital fire direction centers computed firing data faster and with fewer opportunities for manual error. Precision-guided munitions, laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided artillery shells reduced the dispersion of ordnance and allowed smaller safety margins. Despite technological advances, the doctrinal emphasis on human decision remained. Danger close still required a commander to weigh the tactical necessity against the quantified risk. The system did not eliminate the 0.1% probability. It made that probability explicit and assigned responsibility for accepting it. Modern fire support training drilled the procedures repeatedly, using scenarios drawn directly from historical engagements. A surrounded patrol, a base under assault, a platoon pinned by enemy fire with extraction impossible. The inheritance was direct. Officers and NCOs attending fire support schools studied Hill 488, Long Tan, and Khe Sanh, as case examples. The lessons were clear. When survival depends on fire support, units will request it as close as geometry allows. Doctrine must provide the tools to make that decision safely. The 0.1% PI threshold, the risk estimate distances, and the acceptance protocol were all built on the foundation of Vietnam experience. The tables in the modern manuals were not abstractions, they were distillations of decisions made under live fire on Vietnamese hills, in rubber plantations, and around besieged bases. Every number represented a tested limit, every procedure reflected a lesson paid for in casualties. The doctrinal framework that emerged from Vietnam remains in use today. A reminder that controlled risk is still risk, and that, when necessary, accepting that risk can be the difference between survival and annihilation. 1965 to present, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. International historical and humanitarian perspective. A map overlay showing bomb density across Indochina included tonnage figures printed in the margins. Approximately 5 million tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam, and over 7.5 million tons on Indochina as a whole during the war. The total exceeded the tonnage dropped by all sides in all theaters during World War II. Artillery expenditure matched the scale, millions of shells fired in campaigns, defensive barrages, and interdiction missions. Strategically, U.S. doctrine expected overwhelming firepower to guarantee victory. The assumption was that sufficient application of ordnance would degrade enemy capability, disrupt logistics, and break the will to continue fighting. The strategic outcome did not match the expectation. North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front achieved their political objectives despite the weight of fire brought against them. Firepower proved decisive in tactical engagements, but insufficient to resolve the war's larger political questions. Tactically, the story was different. Platoons, companies, and battalions survived because they were willing to accept danger close fire. The decisions made on Hill 488 at Long Tan and around Khe Sanh, decisions to call ordnance within tens or hundreds of meters of friendly positions, saved lives in immediate tactical situations. The individuals who made those decisions acted rationally within the constraints they faced. Withdrawal was often impossible. Reinforcement was often delayed. The choice was fire support inside safety margins or no fire support at all. The long-term human and environmental cost was substantial. Unexploded ordnance remains a problem across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia decades after the war ended. Demoning organizations continue to clear bombs, shells, and submunitions from agricultural land, forests, and populated areas. Civilian casualties from UXO continue to occur. The legacy of danger close and the broader legacy of massive ordnance expenditure are intertwined. The same firepower that saved surrounded units left a residue that persists today. Veteran testimonies describe the experience of calling danger close fire as combining profound relief with lasting responsibility. Relief came from knowing that help had arrived, that artillery or air support would break the enemy assault. Responsibility came from knowing that the request carried inherent risk to nearby troops and, in many cases, to civilians in the area. Some veterans described the weight of having requested fire that they knew would cause destruction close to their own position. Others emphasized that the decision was necessary and that hesitation could have cost more lives. Modern fire support doctrine still defines danger close by 0.1% PI distances and still requires commanders to accept that risk explicitly. The requirement is a reminder that, in Vietnam, survival sometimes depended on trusting mathematics and gun crews more than the safety margins printed in manuals. The legacy is both technical and human. Tables derived from combat experience, procedures built to manage known risks, and the knowledge that firepower, however overwhelming, cannot eliminate the need for difficult decisions under pressure. In Vietnam, calling danger close was not recklessness. It was a calculated choice. A choice to bring the full weight of one's own firepower to the very edge of one's own position, accepting the quantified risk because the alternative was worse.